One of the questions I often get when I present the Rio Grande plan is, why use the Rio Grande Depot? Why not use the Union Pacific Depot instead? Now, I love the Union Pacific Depot. It is a beautiful building, inside and out, and it has been a prominent landmark in our city for over a century. The Rio Grande Depot, on the other hand, occupies a slightly less prominent spot on 300 South, and is often overlooked as being the other old train station downtown. So this video is going to be all about the history of the Rio Grande Depot, and hopefully, by the end, I'll have proved that no other building better represents the history or shared experience of our community, and that the Rio Grande Depot deserves a second life as the new transportation hub of Salt Lake City. First, a bit of railroad history. Everybody knows the story of the first railroad through Utah. With the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit in 1869, the original transcontinental railroad was completed, linking east to west and connecting the Utah Territory to the outside world for the first time. Over the next 50 years, 6 more transcontinental railroads would be built, 2 through New Mexico, 3 through Montana, although the most spectacular of these, the Milwaukee Road, was later abandoned, and 1 additional line through Utah. These 2 lines through Utah were unique from all the others in that they were joint ventures, meaning neither railroad controlled the entire route. Instead of one train running all the way from east to west, passengers would need to change trains halfway through. A passenger riding the Union Pacific Overland route would change to the Southern Pacific in Ogden, while a passenger on the Denver and Rio Grande would need to change to the Western Pacific Railroad in Salt Lake City. Interestingly enough, we have a similar situation today at the Salt Lake City International Airport, where our status as a hub means that a significant portion of the people using this airport aren't stopping here at all. They're just passing through from one airplane to another. This is one of the many reasons the Salt Lake City Department of Airports has rebuilt their terminal with such grand and interesting architecture, so that a layover here changes from being an inconvenience to something of an attraction, all on its own. The big 4 railroad companies in Utah at the beginning of the 20th century had the same idea, and so constructed 3 elegant train stations along the Wasatch Front, which were, like the Salt Lake City Airport, much bigger than their host cities really warranted. The Union Pacific Depot in downtown Salt Lake City came first, likely as a gesture to curry favor in the state capital, and also to assert dominance, as newcomer railroads threatened to break the UP's decade-old monopoly of the Utah market. Those newcomers were the brand new Western Pacific Railroad, and the Denver and Rio Grande, which, though relatively young itself, already had a score to settle with its old rival. And this was no ordinary rivalry. For just one example, when the Rio Grande had first extended their lines to Ogden in 1883, the Union Pacific had won a court injunction against them, preventing them from laying any track within the city limits. In response, the Rio Grande work crews, under the cover of a pouring rainstorm, smuggled supplies into the city and then continued laying their tracks anyway. They were able to put down over 200 feet of track before the Union Pacific watchmen figured out what was going on, and then sent out their own engine and work crew to rip up their competitors' tracks. This wasn't the first time the Rio Grande had been forced to resort to underhanded means either. As a decade earlier, they had tangled with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad over access to the Royal Gorge in Colorado, with both railroads eventually hiring gangs of gunmen to build fortifications, attack each other's work parties, and at one point capture a rival roundhouse. If you don't believe me, go read up on the Royal Gorge War. It really was the Wild West back then. But back to our story. The Denver and Rio Grande were more than willing to keep the rivalry with the Union Pacific going, and in 1906, Chicago-based architect Henry Schlacks was chosen to design what was then referred to as the future Salt Lake City Union Station. Though Schlacks had previously designed the Denver and Rio Grande Depot in Grand Junction, Colorado, he was most famous for his work building churches across the Midwest. The Union Station in Salt Lake City would be his last and largest train station project, ultimately costing $750,000, or roughly twice what the Union Pacific Railroad had spent on their depot. Accounting for a century of inflation, $750,000 is equivalent to $23.5 million today. Henry's first proposal was this one, and it was based heavily on the Gare du Nord in Paris, which, like the Rio Grande Depot, quote,
"The depot is placed at the head of the street, and its unmistakable character distinguishes it clearly, a fact that is appreciated alike by the hurried traveler and by the stranger in the city."
Unquote. The desire to place the depot at the head of a street survived even when the first proposal itself did not. The final version of the plan ended up sharing the same basic form and layout as the Union Pacific Depot, though, true to form, the Rio Grande Depot would be significantly larger in every dimension. Budget issues plagued the construction process from the start, and some of the more ornate features were never installed, such as painted murals or larger chandeliers in the main hall. Even so, the building was still finished to a very high standard of decoration and quality. The iron trim is from the Noelk Richards Iron Works in Indiana. The interior marble was furnished by Volska, Folsch, and Sidlow of Kansas City, and the exterior marble around the building's foundations is a rare Yule marble from the same exclusive quarry in Colorado as the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Inside, the building was laid out with both luxury and efficiency in mind, as Mr. Schlacks himself explained. Quote,
The south half of the building is devoted entirely to the business of the road, while the north half is devoted entirely to the accommodation of its patrons, in looking after their comforts and providing for their wants.
Unquote. Such accommodations included a men's smoking room, a women's retiring room, a restaurant, a barber shop, ticket offices, newsstands, telegraph and telephone offices, and of course, the enormous waiting room, flanked by 3 immense arched windows on each side, made originally of green opalescent glass as an early form of tinting. While many of these features changed over the years, the restaurant remained in its original location for 110 years, until the building was closed following the March 2020 earthquake. Another design feature that was anticipated by the architect but never realized was, believe it or not, a subway system. Quote,
The consensus of opinion is that the business of railroad depots should be handled through subways, and that, although for various reasons, particularly that it would not be advisable to expend the money for this purpose at the present time, this building should be so planned and constructed that the subway system of handling of passengers, etc., can ultimately be introduced or installed. In fact, it has been decided that this particular depot should be a combination of both methods, in which, while the surface handling of business, for reasons given above, must answer for the present time, the subway scheme will ultimately obtain, and the building must therefore, if possible, be arranged with this end in view.
Unquote. While it is possible that Mr. Schlacks was anticipating a train box, such as what we're proposing with the Rio Grande plan, my interpretation is that he was anticipating something more akin to what we'd call today a streetcar tunnel. This was long before transit planners attempted to divide rail into subcategories, such as light rail, metro, heavy rail, and so on. If it was a train on a subterranean track, it was a subway, even if the tunnel was only a short section of a larger streetcar network. In fact, this arrangement was pretty common throughout the early 20th century. Some surviving examples you can ride today are found in Boston, Newark, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Modern examples include Los Angeles, St. Louis, and Seattle, with future tunneling projects being planned in Portland and Dallas. It isn't inconceivable that our own Trax light rail may one day also gain a subway portion downtown, and so validate Mr. Schlack's foresight from 115 years ago. And speaking of grade separations, it's important to note that not all West Side residents were in favor of the new depot and all the new rail traffic it would bring. At one 1899 planning meeting, one resident expressed interest in the railroad sharing a Union Station building, quote,
but not at the expense of residents along their lines. We also desire to have the privilege of crossing our streets without being blocked by waiting trains. What is needed is a proper number of viaducts.
Unquote. Or, in my humble opinion, a train box would serve just as well. But it is interesting to note that these same concerns have been around for over 125 years, and that we are still trying to address them today. Regardless, construction of the new Salt Lake Union Depot soldiered on, and was finally completed in the late summer of 1910. For some context, 1910 was only 17 years after the completion of the Salt Lake Temple, 7 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, and only 4 years after the first copper mine opened in Bingham Canyon. It was also 3 months before the famous Penn Station opened in New York City, a year and a half before the Titanic disaster, 6 years before the Utah State Capitol building was finished, and a full 9 years before Zion National Park, the first national park in Utah, was created. There was no grand ceremony or corporate fanfare on August 20th, 1910. Instead, the station master simply walked from the old timber frame building that was the original depot into the new Union Depot and began announcing trains to whoever walked in. And just like that, the Rio Grande Depot was officially open for business. From the beginning, the depot was popular with residents and visitors, and quickly became one of the focal points of the Salt Lake community. A slew of new stores, restaurants, and hotels sprang up along 3rd South, which was renamed Broadway Street, and local property values soared even as far away as Main Street, over 4 blocks away. Most notable, however, were the new communities of immigrants that flourished with all the new rail traffic. Greektown and Japantown are the most well-remembered today, but communities for African Americans, Italians, Armenians, Syrians, and Mexicans all formed around the Rio Grande Depot and its many freight yards and warehouses. Other migrants continued west, changing trains from the Denver and Rio Grande to the Western Pacific on their way to California, often carrying everything they owned in their suitcases. One of those travelers was an African American woman named Easter Givens from Bastrop, Louisiana, who was traveling west on her own, and who collapsed from exhaustion as she made her way from the train into the depot. A Rio Grande staffer called a doctor and had her carried on a stretcher into the baggage room, where she could recover in peace. It turned out that all she had eaten that day was an orange, and so, at the urging of the staffer, she took a taxi to the Salt Lake County Hospital. The name of that staffer was Gordon Hinckley, who would later become better known as Gordon B. Hinckley, the 15th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Even into his later years, his experiences working at the Rio Grande Depot would find their way into his sermons.
Many years ago, I worked in the head office of one of our railroads. One day I received a telephone call from my counterpart in Newark, New Jersey, who said that a passenger train had arrived without its baggage car. The patrons were angry. We discovered that the train had been properly made up in Oakland, California, and properly delivered to St. Louis, from which station it was to be carried to its destination on the East Coast. But in the St. Louis yards, a thoughtless switchman had moved a piece of steel just 3 inches. That piece of steel was a switch point, and the car that should have been in Newark, New Jersey, was in New Orleans, Louisiana, 1,300 miles away. The course of our lives is not determined by great, awesome decisions. Our direction is set by the little day-to-day choices which chart the track on which we run.
For the Rio Grande Depot, however, its future would be shaped by huge, history-changing events from around the world. Just 4 years after the depot opened, World War I would begin in Europe, followed by a decade of plenty, then a decade of depression, then finally another world war on a scale never seen before or since. The country that emerged from these events was drastically changed from how it had been in 1910, socially, economically, and technologically. And as passenger trains started to disappear in the United States, fears began to grow that the Rio Grande Depot would vanish alongside them. All that and more coming up in